Hi guys, and welcome back to HTP Storytime. Tonight we will see how in Elizabethan England criminals start to get infamy when publicists realize publishing their stories mean big money. Through these books and magazines and pamphlets, we learn about some very interesting tales. While a lot of criminals never were caught, with justice in Elizabethan England what it was, the punishment meted out for those that were caught more than made up for it. One of these stories introduces us to the case of Catherin Hayes, a rebel if ever I saw one. Catherine seemed just as hard as the world she lived in. She came undone, though, when she tried to kill her husband with 2 accomplices. The crime was given as little thought as the investigation afterwards, but it is an amazing story. So let's go. But the age of crime is also the age in which we have the first adequate records of crime. In 1735, when Dick Turpin was still engaged in his gleeful depredations, a bookseller called John Osborne of the Golden Ball in Paternoster Row thought that it might be a profitable idea to gather together some of the lives and exploits of remarkable criminals from the pamphlets that were hawked at Tyburn. And he issued 3 volumes of Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals in that year. 40 years later, in 1774, a gentleman named George Theodore Wilkinson brought the records up to date in the famous Newgate Calendar. The high moral tone of both these works makes them tiresome to read. Their authors were recording the lives of criminals in order to make money, and they felt that they had to disguise this by making their accounts sound like sermons. Quote, "There cannot perhaps be a greater misfortune to a man than is having a woman ill-principled about him, whether as a wife or otherwise," end quote. Says Osborne severely in writing of a highwayman named Picken, "One is struck by the commonplace nature of most of the crimes, the lack of the kind of features that would have interested Sherlock Holmes, for example. The first case in the volume is typical. Jane Griffin, a 40-year-old housewife with a hot temper, lost the cellar key and went to the maid's room to upbraid her. She and the maid had already had several disagreements, and the maid returned the bad language with interest. Jane Griffin was holding a kitchen knife with which she had been cutting a chicken for the children's supper. Jane Griffin was holding a kitchen knife with which she had been cutting a chicken for the children's supper, and she suddenly saw red and stabbed at the maid. Unfortunately, it was a good blow that went straight to the heart. Today, Jane Griffin would get 2 years for manslaughter and possibly a psychiatric treatment. In 1720, though, she was hanged." Osborne's book contains a lengthy account of the 18th century equivalent of the Arden of Faversham case. Catherine Hayes was born Catherine Hall in Birmingham, the daughter of poor parents. In 1705, when she was 15, she was noticed by some army officers who persuaded her to return to their quarters. There she became their collective mistress for a while, until they moved on. She then found a job as a servant with a Warwickshire farmer named Hayes. The son of the house, a carpenter, fell in love with her. One morning they went secretly into Worcester and were married. John Hayes was then 21. After 6 years in the country, his young bride began to dream of London and persuaded her husband to move there. She was so excitable and quarrelsome that her in-laws raised no objection. In London, John Hayes became a successful coal merchant, pawnbroker, and moneylender. His success in this latter occupation lends colour to his wife's assertion that he was unbearably mean. At all events, Hayes was successful in business and in a little over 10 years made enough money to sell his shop in the Tyburn Road and take lodgings nearby. His relations with his wife had deteriorated badly. This may have been due to his meanness and her desire for luxury, or This may have been due to his meanness and her desire for luxury, or there may have been deeper causes. She later told one of her accomplices in the murder that Hayes had murdered 2 of his children in the country, presumably when they were newborn. If Hayes was pathologically mean, there might just possibly be some truth in this story. Early in 1725, a young man named Thomas Billings, a tailor, came to their house, and Catherin Hayes declared him to be an old friend or relative. He stayed with him, and when Hayes went to the country on business, Billings took his place in Catherine's bed. The 2 lovers made the most of their freedom. Throwing parties and spending a great deal of the money that Hayes had taken so long to accumulate. When Hayes returned, he was furious and gave his wife a beating. But for some reason, he did not turn Billings out of the house. Strange. Another friend from Warwickshire now arrived, a Thomas Wood. It was to him that she told the story of her husband killing her 2 children, and she mentioned that Hayes had also killed a man. Wood also became a lover, and her promise that her husband's estate, some £1,500, a fortune for those days, would be put at his disposal when she became a widow. This finally made him agree to help her kill her husband. On the 1st of March 1725, Wood came back from a visit to the country and found Billings, Catherine, and John Hayes in the midst of a drinking session. Wood, who was young and boastful, declared that he had just drunk a guinea's worth of wine and was still sober, and Billings challenged Hayes to drink the same amount, 6 bottles. If Hayes could do it without getting drunk, Billings would buy the wine. If not, Hayes should pay for it. Hayes accepted the offer, perhaps the prospects of Hayes accepted the offer, perhaps the prospect of 6 bottles of free wine was too much for his miserly soul. Billings, Wood, and Catherin Hayes set off for a tavern in New Bond Street, and on the way she pointed out that this would be a good opportunity to kill her husband, of course. In the Bronze Head pub, the 3 of them drank a pint of best mountain wine and asked for 6 pints to be sent up to their lodgings. Catherin Hayes paid 6 shillings, 6 D, I have no idea what this unit is, 6 ducat, I don't know. Okay, paid for it. Perhaps its quality was only half as good as the stuff Wood claimed he had been drinking. Hayes downed the 6 pints of wine without much trouble, while the other 3 drank beer. His wife quietly sent out for another pint, which Hayes, now too fuddled to count the bottles, also drank. He then fell down on the floor, woke up after a few minutes, and staggered off to bed in the next room. The bed was probably the kind that Hogarth portrayed, with its lower end actually on the floor. Hayes fell asleep on his face. Billings came in with a coal hatchet and hit him in the back of the head with it. The blow fractured his skull, and Hayes began to kick his feet in agony, making such a noise that the woman in the room overhead came down to investigate. By this time, Wood had seized the hatchet and given Hayes 2 more blows, which completed the work of killing him. When Mrs. Springate complained that the thudding noise had awakened them, Catherin Hayes explained that her husband had some noisy guests, but that they were about to leave. It must have been a tense moment, and both Wood and Billings were badly unnerved. The next problem was what to do with the body. They had to get it down 2 flights of stairs to the street. Then suppose they bumped into a member of the watch. As soon as Hayes was recognized, they were done for. But Catherin Hayes refused to be panicked. She pointed out that if they cut off her husband's head and disposed of that first, the body would not be identifiable, even if they had to flee from the watch and leave it in the street. The 2 men were already nauseated. The bed was drenched with blood. Blood had even shot up to the ceiling with their hatchet blows. Catherin Hayes suggested that they decapitate her husband with his neck over a bucket to catch the blood. Quick thinking. The 2 men must have been wishing that this business had never started, but there was obviously no way out except to dispose of the body. So they placed the body on the bed, so the head hung over. Catherine Hayes held the bucket underneath the neck. Billings twisted his fingers in the blood-soaked hair, and Wood sawed away at the neck with a carving knife. Hatchet blows would have brought Mrs. Springate down again. When the head was off, they dropped it in the pail and left the headless body to bleed into it. Catherine Hayes recognized that there was still danger. If the head was identified, it would be traced back to her. She proposed boiling it in a pot until the flesh came away, a revolting but sensible idea, but the others were too nervous. They became even more nervous when Mrs. Springate shouted down irritably to know what was going on. Here Catherine Hayes showed a presence of mind that entitles her to be ranked with Alice Arden and Lady Macbeth. She called back that her husband had been suddenly called away on a journey and was getting ready to go. Now the two Thomases could hardly wait to get out of the house. They poured the blood from the bucket down the sink, then had to tiptoe up and down the stairs half a dozen times to get water from the well to wash it down. When that was done, the men crept downstairs, one of them holding the bucket under his coat, while Catherine walked down behind them, talking in a normal voice, saying goodbye to her husband, in case any of the neighbors were listening. According to the sharp-eared Mrs. Springate, she put up an excellent and convincing performance. Then the two men made off as fast as they could, and Catherine Hayes hurried upstairs to clean up the blood before it clotted. It was a long task, because the unpolished floorboards had soaked up the blood like a sponge. Even when she had washed it and scraped it with a knife, the marks were still visible.